Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. I'd built models as a kid back in the 70s and early 80s, and then I got out of it for about 20 years. Didn't come back to the hobby until 2006. And since coming back into the hobby, right up to this very morning when I was checking my computer before doing this video, the questions that I think I see most often have to do with how do I weather my model? Whether it's a lot of weathering, a little weathering, what kind of stuff to use, what order to put it on in, how do I do it? All of those things come up every day in social media, because whether you're wanting to just do a few things or a lot of things, if like anything else, if you don't know how to do it, it's not always apparent. And so over the years, it's been really helpful for me to see how other people do it, and to see the techniques and all of those things. But sometimes I think what is often missing in the technique demonstrations, which, I mean, I do those too, the technique demonstrations, the product demonstrations, sometimes I think that you have to step back from that and look at it and go, well, what's the big picture view of the process? In other words, kind of like if you're going to be going into a sporting event, say an American football game, you go into that with a game plan. And there's been things that happen before the game and plans that take place. And then once you're in the game, you execute them according to your game plan because you're working towards an expected end. And I think, especially when you're starting off, I think having a game plan that you can refer to can be really helpful. Now, before I ever get started on a model, I start thinking about my plan for the weathering. I don't even glue plastic together until I kind of have an idea what is it I'm going for. It may be something that gets adjusted along the way, but I'm going to have a notion up here, as scary a place as this is. I'm going to have a notion up in my head about what it is I'm going for. I may even put a few notes to help me remember I need to do things at certain points. And I think when you're looking at pre-planning, there's going to be two aspects of how you're going to plan that. It can be document driven, and by that I mean if it's, say, a historical subject, a tank or an airplane, you may have actual photos of the real thing. You may have photos of other tanks or airplanes in the same squadron or unit. You may have a specific time period in mind that you have documentation on how the environment looks and things like that. Or if it's, say, a science fiction subject from a movie, you may have some photos of how it looked at the time. Maybe you're wanting to do Luke's X-Wing right before he took off to go blow up the Death Star. Or maybe you want to model it after he returns from that. That can be two different things. So there's a document-driven approach to it where you're looking at, okay, here's some example of an object, and I want to try and replicate that in my weathering. The other is story-driven. Maybe you're doing Gunpla, and you've got, or Machining Krieger, or something like that, and you have an idea of, well, I want to model this mobile suit as if it were in the desert, and it came under fire, and there's certain situations that are going on, and there's certain considerations, and so you kind of have a backstory. Now, it doesn't have to be something that you sit down and write out, 10 paragraphs of story. You could if you want to, but it can simply be 2 or 3 sentences, and those sentences can then help guide you in how that should look. Because if you say, okay, it's going to be in a desert environment, well, that's going to influence maybe how it's painted. That's going to influence how the earth and dust effects look. If it's been in combat a long time, that's going to maybe help you see how you want to do any kind of damage or anything like that. Fluid leaks, stains, whatever. A story-driven or a document-driven approach is going to give you your game plan. Another thing you're going to want to consider are your materials. What do you have on hand? What do you like using? different materials such as oils, acrylics, enamels, pencils, whatever, they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. So, and you may have favorites that you like to use. I personally like to use all of them, but I've worked with them long enough to know where they have their strengths, where they have their weaknesses, and which ones are going to be best used for certain things. The distinction I make in my mind is, as I'm approaching how I want to plan doing it, is I think in terms of whether it's an additive or a subtractive process for whatever material I'm looking to use. By that I mean, typically with oils and enamels, you put on some and then you use thinners and brushes and other things to remove some, to take away some, to blend it in, to develop a streak or a stain or whatever. Those are your subtractive materials. Acrylics, on the other hand, generally, not always, but generally are your additive kind of things. Same way with your pencils. Though your pencils can kind of blur the line between additive and subtractive. But like with acrylics, if you're going to be using acrylic staining for fuel stains, well, it's something you want to build up slowly because generally those can't be blended and removed. So when you're considering your products that you're going to use, kind of work that into your game plan about what's going to be the best order to do this, what's going to be the best place to use it. For example, I like to often start my weathering process at whatever stage it's at with a base of acrylics because I can get some big stains in there. It dries really quick. I don't have to wait a long time. Then I go back over it with oils and enamels because they won't hurt it. And while they take longer to dry, I've gotten in the big stains with the things that dry fast. And then I do refinement, which means there's less of it and it dries faster with the things like oils and enamels. So there are considerations with the materials you're going to be using also. Another thing you're going to want to factor in as you're thinking about how am I going to weather this model is scale considerations. Now, in my mind, I break down three distinctions. There's realistic, there's plausible, and then there's freestyle. And by that I mean if you're modeling, let's say a Spitfire, because I love Spitfires. If you're modeling a Spitfire and you have a picture of a Spitfire and you have other pictures of how Spitfires are weathered and you're going for a realistic look, then you're going to want to really be careful in how you apply weathering, chipping, staining, fluid leaks, and all of that. And you want to keep it in scale with what you're modeling and appropriate for examples that you see in pictures and things like that. If you're trying for a more plausible approach, it's not necessarily realistic. And this may be applied to a real world object or something in science fiction. For example, you may be building, I'll use Maschinen Krieger again as an example. You may be building Maschinen Krieger. That's obviously not a real object in terms of, there's none that have ever been used in history. It's something from the future. But when you're planning your weathering, when you're doing it, you can go, okay, I'm not going to go for so much a realistic potential look, but I'm going to go for plausible. Yeah, this could have happened. You know, it's not the typical, it's not the norm, but I've seen this in, say, a real world object, and so I'm going to model that on this one. It's plausible. A good example of this, there's a famous picture from World War II of a P-47 that got hit in an oil line, and literally from the cowling back, it's all just oil. It's just black. I mean, it's over the canopy, it's down the side of the aircraft. The whole thing is black. Now, if you did that and somebody wasn't aware of that picture, they would go, that's not realistic. And you go, well, in this case it is, because you've got a photo. But let's say you applied that thinking to Maschinen Krieger, and somebody said, that's not necessarily realistic. Well, you'd say, well, number one, it's make-believe. And number two, it's plausible, and here's why. So I think having a plausible approach can help you in determining how you want to do the weathering. And then finally, there's what I call freestyle. And that's, look, you decide, I don't care if this is realistic or even plausible. You know, maybe I've seen I've seen people do this a lot with Zaku's, and I think a Gunpla model kit. I think it looks really cool. They'll just rust the heck out of the thing. I mean, it's totally out of scale. It's totally out of proportion to the size of it. It's not anime accurate. It may even bring the scale down. It may make it look like just a man-sized suit, but the effect is so cool. If you're wanting to have fun with weathering, if you're wanting to have fun with rusting and staining and streaking, and you go, to heck with realism, to heck with plausibility, I'm going freestyle, do it. Because ultimately it's about having fun. But picking one of those three approaches is going to help drive the planning for your weathering playbook. Okay, just a few other big picture considerations that I think you'll need to take into account. First, layers give depth. When you're weathering your model, you can, and you see it all the time, and I understand because you have to start somewhere, but somebody will paint a model and they'll do a nice job on the painting. They'll put the decals on, do a nice job on that. They'll do panel lining, it all looks good, and then they'll say, okay, I'm gonna go weather. And they'll get one color of Tamiya powder and they'll do some smears on it. Or they'll get one color of an oil streaking, oil brushes or something like that, and they'll do some streaks on it. Maybe they get an acrylic product and they just model some of that on there, and that's it. Now, if you're doing that and you like doing it, don't stop. If that's how you're happy, that's what it's all about, is having fun in this hobby. But as you're growing, as you're wanting to improve in your weathering, the more layers you put on, the more depth the model has. And by depth, you've seen this. Go look at guys like Lincoln Wright, Daniel Zamara-Bidet, Martin Kovac from Night Shift Scale Models on YouTube. Check him out. There's a lot of guys that do that high-level work where you see layer upon layer upon layer of weathering, and none of it is overwhelming. It all fits together. But the more layers you have, the more you're going to be able to convey whatever it is you're trying to get across, whether it's realism, whether it's plausibility, or just freestyle. If you want to get across, okay, this is just a really rusty object, then having lots and lots and lots of rust tones is going to look better than just picking one and going with it. So layers really help add a new dimension to your finished model. Another thing weathering can do is draw attention to features. Many times especially if a model is, say, darker, it's a dark blue or a dark green or a dark red or whatever. When it's darker, sometimes if you're looking at it at normal viewing distance, it can be hard to see all of the features if you don't take some additional steps to make those pop out. And a great way to do that is weathering that uses some contrast. So as you're developing that game plan, think about, how do I want to bring attention to features? How do I want to draw out detail? And how can I use weathering, or maybe other steps, to make those things apparent? Okay, and finally, for big picture considerations, and I'm sure there's other things that you could add to the list, but I think it has to be stated, not every part has to be weathered. Not every part has to be equally weathered. That can often give interest to the model if everything's not the same. I've used this as an example a lot in my blog and in video. Maybe you have a Gunpla that's been, fighting in a temperate environment, and he's walking through some woods and he slips and falls in a swamp, and the whole right side of the mobile suit is covered in dirt and grime and everything. I mean, because you could imagine how much it would splash up if this giant, 18-meter tall object fell into a swamp. It would, it'd get scrapes from the trees and everything else. So you may want to do one where, okay, he was a fairly clean mobile suit before he went out that day, and he comes back and one side of him is just covered in mud and the other's just maybe got a few scratches and some dust on it. Everything doesn't have to be equal. In fact, I would make the suggestion that things are more realistic if they're not, more plausible even, if they're not equal. Now, our brains like for things to be equal. I have a hard time with that because I'm one of those guys that when I eat M&Ms, I arrange them by color and by the number of M&Ms I have, and then I begin eating them in a certain order so they all come out even. Yeah, that's a level of crazy a lot of people don't have right there. So it's really hard when I'm weathering to try and say, okay, this needs to be different on this side or that side. Even when I make it different, I find that there is some pattern to it, but I hope I'm able to disguise it. But anyway, it doesn't all have to be the same. Okay, that's a lot of stuff to think about before you get started. And you may write this down, you just may think of it in your head. You just may go, I'm going to build this Zaku and it's going to be really rusty. I keep bringing that up. Maybe I need to build a rusty Zaku. Anyway, those are the things you're going to think about ahead of time. When it's time to get to work, weathering in your final finish starts with the preparation of the model. By that I mean you want to go in and make sure you're filling in the seams, you're closing gaps, you're sanding things down, you're removing mold seams. You want to give a good base for the rest of your model's finish to go on top of. Because no matter how good a job, like if you're going for a plausible approach on a model, no matter how good of a job you do on everything, if there's a big honking seam line running down the front of the leg of, say, your gunpla, and it's obvious it's not a panel line, well, it's going to suddenly go from being, hey, that looks like how that would look if it were real, to it's a toy that's been weathered. Now, as I always say, if that's what you're going for, if you're happy with that, I'm not saying don't do it. But the preparation you put in ahead of time, the elbow grease you put in ahead of time, and I'll admit, that's the part of modeling I hate the most. I get tired of filling in panel lines, or not panel lines, but seams, and cutting away mold lines. I mean, if I'm going to miss anything, it's going to be that stuff, because that's the part I find the most boring. But it's one of the most important steps because it's the foundation for the whole thing. So make sure you're putting in some good time at the very early parts of the construction with doing that. Also, if you're going to be doing any kind of damage effects, maybe you want to show some bullet holes, things like that, you're going to want to add those on before you do any other kind of painting. For example, if you're going to show where a round went through some armor, you may want to thin that down from the inside so that it has a more scale realistic effect. That also allows you to show where the metal is going to bend inward to the round going in, and not necessarily out. And there's a lot of considerations that go into that, but doing your damage before you get to any other steps is going to be useful. Maybe you're going to build in some of the internal structure. You want to do all of that ahead of time. Okay, once you get that done, you can start priming. I generally say prime all the time. If you're not sure whether you should prime, prime. If you've been doing this a while and you know when it's safe to not prime, I don't even need to go into that. You know when you can and can't do it. If you're not sure, prime. Doesn't matter whether it's a lacquer primer, enamel primer, acrylic primer. You just want to get some primer on there. My two preferences are either for Badger Stynylrez primer as an acrylic, and I've used that on a lot of things. I put lacquers over that. I put other acrylics over that. I've done enamel washes over that. So I like that, and I like rattle can primers from Tamiya and Mr. Color. That's what I use virtually all the time. They're great primers. There's certainly others. If you have a favorite one, keep using it. But you're going to want to prime before you do anything else. Now, something that needs to be taken into consideration when you're priming is the later colors that are going to go on top of it. If you're going to want to have some really bright, saturated colors, maybe you're doing a Granddaddy Gundam, the RX-78-2, and you want those colors to be bright, you're probably going to want to prime in white so that when you put on the white armor and the blue and the red and the yellow, that they take on a really bright look. If you're wanting to have a mix of some bright colors and some desaturated colors, then maybe gray is a good choice. If you're wanting a really desaturated look with a lot of shadows built in, black can be a choice. But if you're going to build a model that's mostly red, well then prime with brown or a dark red. Or if it's going to be some other color that is going to be the predominant color, then save yourself a little time and prime with something that's close to that, so you don't have to spend a lot of time covering up primer. You can actually use the priming coat to help along your base paint. Now, I'm only going to briefly mention pre-shading and the hairspray technique. Hairspray is often used for chipping and distressing of paints. Pre-shading is used to darken in panel lines and features. Some people like doing that, some people don't. So I'll just say, if those are effects that you're going to use, you're going to need to bring them into your playbook at the appropriate points. For example, if you've just primed your model and you're wanting to do pre-shading, then you pre-shade before the base coat. If you're priming in a rust kind of color and you're wanting that to show through as chipping, then you may want to put on some hairspray or other chipping fluid before you put on your base paints. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that, but you have to factor those in as you're working along. Once your model's primed, you're ready for your base paint. Whatever those colors are, I generally like to put on the color that's going to be the majority color. You know, let's say if I'm doing a machining Krieger kit, maybe I'll put on some RLMO2 over the whole thing, and then that'll later let me put in the other colors, whether it's freehanding a camouflage pattern with my airbrush or painting it on by brush and then putting in small details. You want to go from your major colors to your minor generally. Sometimes you need to put in some of the minor stuff first. Sometimes you got to do some masking if you've got some details in there. But in your weathering playbook, after primer, put on all your base paints. Now, another consideration when you're putting on those base paints is adding what I call distressed effect, and others I think call that too. And what that generally is an attempt to replicate some faded looks, some streaking, some sun-dried looks, and that sometimes is appropriate to do before you're going to put on anything else. Sometimes you can do it afterwards. The break point in my mind, if I'm going to do some kind of distressing effect, is how heavy of an effect do I want? So if I want a very heavy distressing effect, I tend to put some on right after or in conjunction with the base paint. And then I may add some later. If I'm wanting a more light look to it, I may add it after the decals. But keep that in mind when you're doing your base paints. Are you going to be doing some paint distressing, and how heavy do you want it? And that will drive where you put it in the process. If you're not sure and you want to do some distressing effects, you know, some modeling with a lighter color, some modulation, some airbrushed streaks or something like that, put those on ahead of everything else, because you can later go back and weather your decals and all of that to match it if you're not sure. But that's something, and you don't have to do it. There's models that I do that I don't do it because it's not in the playbook for what I'm trying to achieve. But if you're wanting to put in distressed effects, think about that as you're doing your base colors. All right, the next thing that I recommend you do as you develop your game plan, after you get your base colors down, I generally gloss coat the model. Not always, but that's probably another video. For a basic playbook, after you get your base colors down, gloss coat the model. It doesn't matter what kind of gloss coat you use, just gloss coat it. You want a smooth finish for your decals to go on. I generally use Future, Pledge, Clear, the floor polish for that, because it's just a utility coat. I just need something glossy and shiny that I'm going to later cover up. I don't care if it's a real high quality modeling type of gloss finish, because in the end it's not going to be glossy anyway. So I just use it because it's a good utility coat. But if you like using Tamiya or some kind of rattle can gloss coat, use it. The point is, get a good gloss coat down on your model. After getting your gloss coat on, apply your decals. I'm not going to go into detail about applying those decals, but now's the time that you would want to do it. Get the decals on, use your setting solutions and all that to make sure they're down there snug, make sure there's no air bubbles underneath them. You want to get them looking really good on top of that gloss coat. Okay, now here's a break point that it's kind of hard to tell you when you should absolutely do this or not, for me, it just depends on the final finish that I'm going for. Sometimes on a model, after I get the decals on, I may want to put on another clear coat. Certainly I would recommend putting on one to seal in the decals from the additional steps you're going to do. Whether that's a gloss seal or a satin or a matte finish is really going to depend on the later effects that go on, because there's some later effects that work better over a gloss coat. There's some that work better over a satin coat, and a few that work good on a matte coat. But you don't want to be spending a lot of time putting coat after coat after coat of just clear stuff. So I try to avoid doing that too often. I think for me, the best middle of the road kind of approach is when I get my decals on, I brush seal them in with some additional future so that it leaves the model glossy. And then I go on to the next step, which I'm going to talk about in a second here. And then after that step, then I apply an additional top coat. And that may be the last one that I apply to the model. Now, one more kind of caveat consideration at this point. When you have your decals down, you're going to want to seal them. Like I said, I brush paint on some gloss coat just to seal those in. This may be a point that you want to either do some of your first distressing if you're wanting to do lighter distressing so that you can include the decals in this, or you may want to enhance previous distressing that you've done. Now, if you don't want to do any distressing at all, you don't have to worry about it. But after the decals is a good time to do some paint distressing so that it gets the decals and the surface of the model, the base paints, all distressed. You know, they're all just sitting around biting their nails. Anyway, get the distressing done, whether it's with oils, whether it's with airbrush, something like that. You're just going to have to kind of experiment to know what's going to work for you. Now, the next step I usually go into, and keep in mind at this point, the model is mostly still gloss. At this point, I go into doing my panel lining. Now, you can use oils, you can use enamels, you can use acrylics. I've used pencils for it, mechanical pencil. Whatever you use, you want to put that down after your decals, because you want to get the panel lining in on top of the decals. I've seen a lot of really good looking models that had great panel lining, great weathering and all of that, but you could tell they put on the decals towards the end, or they failed to do any panel lining on it. And so I saw one recently that it was an olive drab aircraft, American aircraft from World War II. It looked really good. Everything was just great, but the decals just kind of sat there on top. They were shiny and white with no panel lining through them, nothing, you know. So it was a good model, and the guy was proud of it, and rightly so. But I'm thinking in my mind, you could have, if you'd have done that next step, the whole thing would have looked organic to it. So at this point, you're going to want to do your panel lining. Now, the benefit of having a gloss coat is if you're using oils or enamels, you can put those panel lining, you can put those materials in there, and then just use a Q-tip or something like that to wipe them up. With acrylics, you have to be a little more careful. You can clean them up if you do it quickly, but they're generally have to be put in more precisely. Pencils, you can do those anytime, but get your panel lining done. Okay, now we're getting to what I think of as the really fun stuff. All the steps up till now for me are always kind of boring. I do all of those previous steps to start getting to this stuff, which I think is the fun stuff. First thing I do after the panel lining is I go into chipping. Now, at this point, this is usually where I put a satin finish on the model, because everything I want to do after this is going to benefit from a satin finish rather than a gloss finish. I've done it all the way to the end over a gloss finish and then just put on a matte coat, but I like putting on a satin finish generally right after the panel lining to establish the surface for everything else. And the first thing I get to after that, like I said, is chipping. Now, some considerations to make in your chipping: color considerations and scale considerations. For color, you need to think in terms of contrast. If you want that chipping to be seen, there has to be some contrast. So for example, if you have a dark gray finish, you may want to think about, do I want to do a lighter gray, or do I want to do, is it appropriate to do silver, some kind of metallic color under it? Do I want to do two color chipping where I do a lighter one for contrast and then a darker one to show the underlying material? So you have to think in terms of the colors that you're going to put on there. And like sometimes I use chipping as much to help bring out features of a model as I do to make it look worn. So chipping can serve as a sort of, if you're familiar with Games Workshop and the way they do edge highlighting on a lot of their models, chipping can serve as sort of a way of doing edge highlighting to help pop out those details. Another consideration, of course, is scale. And this goes back to, am I doing this as realistic, as plausible, or freestyle? If you're doing realistic, then you want to look at whatever your example is and do the chipping the way they show there. If you're wanting to do plausible, then you're going to be thinking in your mind, okay, what's a scenario that this thing could have gone through, even if it was just kind of a weird one-off event like the P47 I talked about and the oil staining. How is that going to drive this? And also, when you're thinking in terms of scale, go look at some modern equipment, bulldozers and work equipment and just trucks and cars and things like that. You know, you'll see that very rarely is paint chipping this giant thing. It's maybe at most as big as your hand. It's maybe a little bigger. One of the things I like doing is I keep the little figures that come in gunpla kits or other model kits that are, you know, 1/144 scale, 1/100 scale, 1/48 scale, whatever. I like keeping those on my workbench, so as I'm working on chipping, I can look at that as kind of a reference and go, how is this in relation to the size of a man? But scale consideration on your chipping is something to factor in. Even if you factor it in and go, I don't care, make that decision and it will help drive everything else. The other things some other things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some other things to think about, you're going to want to do chipping on any damaged areas, whether it's chipping to make it look damaged or areas that you may have physically added damage to before you ever got to painting. You're going to want to do some chipping there because certainly if a round hits something, if it blows a hole in it, there's going to be some kind of chipping, there's going to be some kind of material exposed underneath, so do that. If you're doing any kind of, you're going to decide what material am I going to use. Am I going to use acrylic? Am I going to use a sponge? Am I going to use a paintbrush? Am I going to use a pencil? My typical playbook for chipping is I use all of those. I start generally with sponge chipping, whether I'm doing it light or heavy, and I pick a color. Maybe that color is to show an underlying composite material. Maybe it's to show an underlying material that can rust so I can later develop it. So I pick that color, I do some sponge chipping, then I go in and I do some paintbrush chipping to add streaks and develop larger chips. And then I may go into areas with a pencil and say, okay, I'm just going to do some really fine chips here. But I get the model chipped like I want, and then it's ready for the next step. All right, after chipping, I like to do rust effects. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, rust effects generally develop from where chips are. If you have a material underneath the paint that's one that can rust, regardless of the genre, if there's no damage to the paint, generally you're not going to see rust. It's only where there's damage that you're going to see rust, and that damage is going to be where the chips are. And that's something to think about when you're doing your chips. Sometimes I like putting chips in specific areas knowing that I'm going to rust those later. So again, having this as a game plan really helps drive this. But when you're doing your rust colors, apply them next, whether it's acrylics or oils or whatever, or a combination. I usually use a combination of oils and acrylics. I may throw in some pencils, things like that. Do at least 3 colors. Sometimes you can get away with 2. I've done that before, depending on the rest of the way the model looks. But you're going to want generally a darker tone, a darker brown, a darker orange, kind of a medium orange, and then either something that's a little brighter or maybe more towards the ochre end of things, the yellow ochre, kind of a yellowish tone. Don't do your rust stains with just one color, because if you go look at any object, real world objects that's rusted, it's never just one color. It's multiple colors. There's going to be some dark stuff in there. There's going to be some stains that come down. There's going to be the area that's rusted, and then where the water hits the rust and it runs down, there's going to be streaks that are maybe lighter orange coming down from that. And it doesn't take a lot of time to develop those, and you don't necessarily need to do it all over the model. But just a few key places will sell the notion of rust, and using multiple colors on top of each other in thin layers really helps bring that across. Okay, the next thing I like to do are putting on fluid stains, leaks, and this includes everything from hydraulic fluid to oil to fuel to anything that's internal or maybe even external to the model. You know, there have been times, I saw one time somebody did a large scale model of an airplane, and they had what, you couldn't tell it unless they explained it, but they had put a coffee stain on it, like somebody had been standing there drinking coffee and then dropped it, and there's just this weird colored stain, you know, near the wing root, and there's no apparent point of where it came from. I was like, what is that? And they said, that's coffee. And I'm like, that's cool, it tells a story. But whatever the fluid is, now look around your model and look for places, that's a new word. It's kind of like places, only not. Look for places that would have logical fuel stains or fluid stains. It may be something that's red, kind of like diesel. It may be dark black like oil. It may be more brownish like fuel. There may be, you know, radiator fluid can be kind of green. If you're doing science fiction, it can be any color you want. It can be bright red. It can be purple. Look for places, though, where there's pipes, where there's damage, where there's seals, where there's access doors. You know, one of my favorite places to do fluid staining on a gunpla is right at the hip joints, where the leg joins to the hip, because you've got this 65-foot tall, 18-meter tall object that's running and doing somersaults and bouncing off each other and all of these, you know, things. There's a lot of fluid dynamics going on in those legs. There's a lot of hydraulic stuff going on, and I don't care how futuristic it is, it's going to leak. So I like putting in a lot of stains in those areas and streaks, and I always use at least 2 colors. So looking around your model and adding multiple points of color that are fluid streaks and that may be pooled up in some areas. If it's on a horizontal surface, maybe it's pooled up. If it's on a vertical surface, maybe it's streaked down. Maybe as it's streaked down and it, you know, it's streaking down a vertical surface, but then it gets to a horizontal surface and it pools up down there. It can tell a story. And again, it doesn't have to be on every part of the model. I actually think it makes it more interesting if you say, okay, here's a part that has a whole lot of streaking, fluid streaking for some reason, and then the rest maybe doesn't have that. It all adds to the plausibility of selling the notion of the scale and the size of the whole thing and whatever's going on with the model. It helps tell the story. But that's a great way to really boost the realism up, is paying attention to your fluid stains and your streaks and the colors and where they're placed and just the volume of how they're there. All right, after the fluid stains, I like to put on environmental effects. The logic there is that while this thing may be moving around, there may have been a point where it had a fluid stain and it stained the side of the vehicle or the mobile suit or the airplane or whatever you're doing, and they repaired where the leak was, but because they didn't have a lot of time, they left the stain. So that stain may sit there a long time. Earth effects, dirt, dust, mud, are going to go over that. And it's okay sometimes if you completely cover up previous effects with dirt and dust and mud. You want to put them underneath so that they show properly, you know, that you can see, okay, I see the beginnings of a streak and then there's dirt on top of that, so I know there's something going on there. The environmental effects are typically going to be always present. Stains may not be always present. Fluid leaks may not always be present. They may not always be happening. But if it's moving around in most environments, there's going to be some kind of dirt, dust, water, rain, something. You know, maybe not if you're doing a mobile suit that's exclusively in space. That's probably going to be more confined to chipping and things like that. But then again, you know, how many of them, they fight out in space and then they come down to Earth and they fight on Earth and they go back up in space. It's your decision how you want Earth effects on there. at the very least, earth effects give people, again, a sense of scale. And those earth effects can be airbrushed on, they can be put on with weathering powders. Splattering is a great way of doing that. Acrylics work really good for that. So any of the tools that you've used to apply any other process, you focus that on some browns and some, some sludgy kind of greens and things like that, and adding in those both wet and dry effects, it's really going to look good at the end. The final effect I normally put on if I'm doing this in kind of a playbook fashion is soot and exhaust effects. Those are, if you've got a model, let's say you've got a tank that's got all sorts of chips and streaks and stains and mud and things like that, even if it's just sitting in the motor pool with all of that stuff on it, when they turn it on, the exhaust is going to go on top of all of that. That's going to be always present. So I put on my exhaust effects later, generally towards the end of the build. And again, that can be oils, it can be enamels, it can be airbrushed, it can be brushed, you can use powders. All of those things work well. Using multiple colors still helps here. Like on aircraft, a lot of times I put down a base of a light gray that I show as a streak back from the exhausts. And then I go in and kind of in the center of that, I do a darker color. And so what happens is you get two colors there and then some blending between the two, and it makes people think, okay, that's a sooty, exhaust-stained area. And again, use reference photos from real-world objects. Even if you're doing, something from Star Wars or something from machining, something that's science fiction, something that doesn't actually exist, if it's got something that has an exhaust, that exhaust is going to behave the same way as your car or a bulldozer or a truck or an airplane or anything else. So pay attention to real-world references to get those effects in. They're also important to do on gun barrels. Whenever a gun fires, there's going to be some kind of soot. Now, you can say, yes, but what if it's smokeless ammunition? That's no fun. We want smoke. We want fire. we want soot. So adding soot to the end of a gun barrel, adding soot, like if you have a gun that, like on some gunpla, they have the guns right up here on their head, right? Well, adding some soot stains along the side of the head so when it fires, it shows that. Yeah, okay, maybe it's realistic if you think in that sense that it would have smokeless ammo, but it doesn't sell the notion that here's a shooty pew pew thing, right? So you want to put some soot stains on anything that's a shooty pew pew thing because it just sells the notion to the brain. I even do it where there's a laser. There might not be anything on a laser, but I'm thinking, okay, it's plausible that there may be a lot of heat buildup there, that may make the paint, get burned or some kind of effect like that. So it sells the notion of what's happening on the model. Okay, the final step that I take when I've done all of this weathering is I generally set it aside for a while. Maybe it's 4 hours, maybe it's overnight, maybe it's a week. And then I come back and I look at it and I hold it out in front of me and I just kind of look at it and I go, does it all make sense? Because sometimes you may turn it upside down, you may look on the underneath part and you may go, I completely forgot to weather that, or I didn't chip that and it should logically be chipped, or I've got a fluid stain there that I think I want to develop a little more. Maybe the dirt effects need to be toned down or added to. You just look at it holistically and you see, what do I want to add? What do I want to adjust? Not necessarily to make it symmetric, but to just make it look organic, to make it look right in your mind. Because ultimately, when you're building it, you're the final judge. You can ask people what they think, you can get opinions, but ultimately you have to decide. And so I just sit down and I have all of the materials I've used sitting there with me. And if I need to go in and add some streaking here, I'll do that. If I need to add some more chipping there, I'll do that. I will look at it. I may even photograph it, because sometimes photography will help you see things that you don't see with your eye. There have been plenty of times that I've done that where I would take a close-up photo and I would be thinking a section looks good, and then I get in there and realize that there had been a cat hair in the doggone thing. And I have to go in there and figure out, okay, am I going to have to get that out? What am I going to do with it? Great thing for covering up cat hairs, make them chipping. Put some chipping over them, no more cat hair. But that final look over is when you're going to adjust everything so that it all looks as one organic single piece. And then here's the part you've been waiting to hear for quite a while now. Finally, if you're going to put some kind of top coat on it, obviously now's the time to do it. Here's the way I decide if I'm going to do a top coat. If the model has already been satin coated, all of these other materials that I put on top of it are going to matte it down generally. Now, you may want some fluid stains that are glossy, and you want to leave them that way, which is fine. But if it's already got the finish on it that I want, and it's just going to sit on my shelf, and because once I put them on my shelf, I don't ever touch them again. I rarely even look at them. If it's just going to sit on my shelf, I just leave it like that because I'm happy with the finish the way it is. However, if you're going to be handling the model a lot, maybe you're doing some miniatures for playing Warhammer, or it's a Gunpla and you like going over every now and then and posing it or doing it, moving it around or something like that, you may want to look at doing a top coat. Now, if you've done all of this weathering and staining and streaking and all these other things I'm talking about, you probably want to go for a matte coat, at least a satin coat. And again, whatever you like using, whether it's rattle can, whether it's some kind of acrylic, whether it's something a little stronger, I prefer to use acrylic at the end because I don't want to apply anything that's hot enough to potentially cause damage to everything underneath. At that point, I don't want to take that chance. So I like doing acrylic top coats, and I generally use a matte top coat if I'm going to do it. But you can use whatever you want depending on the final finish you want. The other circumstance, and this is one that I consider more often, is if you're going to be giving away or selling your work. Most of what I do, I end up selling on eBay. If you're going to be selling it, you really want to put some kind of top coat on it to protect the finish, because the buyer is likely to pick it up, look at it, handle it. I've had a couple of people that bought my stuff and then they gave it to like their 5-year-old to play with, and here's this painted, weathered Gunpla, and they're giving it to a 5-year-old, and then they contact me and they go, well, why is everything wearing off? And I'm like, well, because he's dragging it through the sandbox. You just can't help that. But in general, a top coat will help protect that finish. It may impart a finish that you want. If it's already satin or glossy and you want it to be just drop dead flat, then you're going to want to put that top coat on it. But that's something you've got to decide. Okay, I know I've gone through a lot of steps, and if you're sitting there trying to take notes, you may be rewinding this and all of this, and I probably should have mentioned this beforehand. If I remember, I'll put a little thing down at the bottom of the screen. Anyway, I'm going to make all of these notes. In fact, as I've been filming this, I film a little bit, and then I look over here, and I look at my notes, and then I turn back to the camera, and I talk a little more. I'm going to flesh out my notes, and I'm going to put them in PDF form available for free online. They're going to be linked down below. And if I remember, they may be linked up here or wherever it's going to be. But there'll be a PDF available that you can use. And keep in mind, this is not a list of how you must do it. This is a suggested playlist, I guess you would say. Whenever you buy cereal or other kind of boxed foods, it'll show a picture of it, and then down below it says serving suggestion. It's like they're saying, this isn't the way you have to eat it, this is a way to eat it. I'm telling you a way you can weather your models. You don't have to do it this way. You may do it a lot less than I'm talking about. You may do it a lot more. After you get experienced with it, you'll start being more comfortable with swapping orders, doing it. You may do a little of this and a little of that and a little of this and a little of that, and it's just a hodgepodge, but it all comes together at the end. But I think having a logical sequence. If you're not familiar with weathering, if you're not comfortable with weathering, having a logical sequence so you see how it all goes together and you start applying that to your models, after a while, you'll start morphing that into your own method. I've written some blog articles over the years about how I weather things, and I can go back and read what I wrote 5 years ago, and I do it a little bit different now than I did then. So it's a constantly evolving process, but having a foundation of how each of these effects works and how it adds to the big picture and how layers of detail give depth to your model is really going to help change the way your models look. And I think ultimately, and this is the point, this is really the point of what I'm getting at, the more steps you have, the better the finish you're going to have, the greater the depth of the finish. I think you're going to have more fun. I know I do. I mean, sometimes, yeah, it's cool to just snap something together and paint it a couple of colors and set it aside because you just want something to do on an afternoon. But when it comes to, okay, I'm going to put in, most of my models, I put in 40 or 50 hours. If I'm going to put in 40 or 50 hours worth of time to a model, I want to extract all the fun I can out of that. I want to enjoy the process. And so doing these weathering steps, that's what I look forward to. That's the fun of the model. You know, yeah, I kind of like the building and the decals and the base painting. And I mean, all of that, I like it okay. But it's a lot of it is just a process of hurrying through all of that to get to the weathering. So the ultimate goal of all of this is to have fun. Because I've said it before, and I'll say it again probably before the end of this video. If you're not having fun in this hobby, you're doing it wrong. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I know it's been kind of a long ramble, but I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's given you the vision of what a playbook, a playlist of some planning and thinking ahead. I hope it's given you an idea of how it can improve your models and improve your fun, because that's so important in this hobby, is to have fun. So thank you for watching this video. And thank you also for supporting me on social media, for subscribing to this channel. And it's down here, no, here, one of the places. There's a place to subscribe. So please go ahead and subscribe. I would appreciate it. Hit the little bell icon so you'll know when I have new videos come out. I try to get 2 a week. I may have to just do 1 a week every now and then because life happens, but I try to get 2 a week, so please hit that bell icon. Follow me on social media. All of those links are below. And of course, I have a Patreon account, because Patreon is what makes this possible for me to do the modeling and the videos and get the supplies and all of the things I need, because we just wouldn't be able to afford for me to do it at the pace that I do it and with the materials that I do it with if it weren't for Patreon. We just wouldn't be able to afford for me to do it. So this is really making it possible. It really is helping out. It's something that every time I get a new patron, I tell my wife about it, and she's like, "Oh, that is so great." I mean, my family is incredibly grateful for this. So please take a look at the link to Patreon, see what we have there, what I have there available for the different levels, and I would appreciate your consideration. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much. I mean, you guys are the one who make it happen. Thank you for sticking with me even in this difficult time. It means so much to me, and again, my family, that you do this. All right, as promised, I'm going to leave you with a final thought. If you're not having fun in this hobby, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.